So let's talk about allusions. Allusions with an A. Allusions are just references that poets make in their poems. So sometimes it might be at the beginning, it might be a line quoted by someone else. Um, it might be a dedication, for example. Um, so it could be something like there's a poem by Eve Ewing called Affirmation, where she dedicates it to um, the youth living in prison after Asada Shakur. So you would have to look up who Asada Shakur is and talk about like what she means by she's talking to the youth living in prison, right? It adds context to the poems. It's also a way to sort of educate yourself on what people are talking about in their poetry. Sometimes you might miss it, sometimes you might get it. I recommend always look up stuff that you don't know. There's no shame in doing that. You need to do that. It's a great way to learn new things, right? So if we look at affirmation, right, it's youth living in prison after Asada Shakur. You can look up Asada Shakur and realize that she was involved in a police shooting and was basically charged with murder, etc. That adds this whole new context to this poem that in general is pretty positive, right? Like in the poem it talks about how, you know, I believe that the sun shines, if not here, then somewhere, right? That's a pretty positive message. And then you start to look into Sada Shakur and you might realize like that she's hoping for these positive things, and yet maybe they're not attainable or achievable, right? Some other examples are this poem by Tyrone Williams, where it references the Gap, right? Which could represent like the actual jean company, the actual like clothing company, the Gap, right? And then you have like Staggered Lees, which is a play on Stagger Lee, which is this common folk song, which has been done by like Woody Guthrie and Cap Calloway, Duke Ellington, Leadbelly. It's just this very popular folk song. And then to go along with that, it references John Henry, another folk hero, right? And then another reference to Buster Keaton, who was a like stunt person who made these movies. Like, for example, in this one, he hopefully you can see it on the shared screen, but he has this house fall on him, and it's actually real. Like that was several thousand pounds that could have fallen on him. So he just like did all these crazy stunts. It was he's like kind of a comedian, but you have all these like older references in this poem, and unless you look them up, you have no idea what it's about. So I highly recommend looking up these references to understand what they might be talking about. Look for interviews that poets might be talking about these things. For example, in here, unless you really think about the time frame that this poem is from, which is like 2016, you might not realize that when he talks about bad day to be a boy and July and these boys can't recall their white shirt turned a ruby gown, he's not talking about these literal things. He's talking about like police shootings involving young black men, right? And so unless you know that, like the poem kind of loses some of its meaning. It's really important to know what the context is for some of these things. So allusions are these references to things that make the poem a little bit more understandable. And it's really hard to know what references people are making in their poems sometimes. So don't feel like dumb not getting it. Don't feel like you just like missed it. Sometimes it's really hard. I always recommend, like, for example, in the Tyrone Williams poem, you can look up Stagger Lee, you can look up John Henry, you can like Busted by Keaton, you might not be able to find because you don't know who Buster Keaton was, and so you don't understand why he's playing with that term, right? So you can get some of these and you can't get others, right? So try your best. That's my recommendation. If you have any questions, I could try to help you. But allusions are really important. They're in poetry all the time. It's important to understand the context of the poem in which it's being written. So look up the authors that they talk about, look up the events they talk about, and I feel like you'll get a better understanding of what the poem is trying to do. You can have your own interpretation, but allusions will help you kind of place it into what the author wants you to understand. So hopefully that helps. And hopefully you understand allusions a little bit more.